Hi, this is David Unsworth, English editor of the PanAm Post. Today we'll be speaking with journalist David Biller, a staff writer at Bloomberg News and a contributor to Business Week. He writes frequently about Brazilian politics and economics and has recently penned an article about a large migration of the Indigenous Warao people from northeastern Venezuela to the Brazilian city of Manaus in the wake of Venezuela's political turmoil and economic collapse. David, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
The Warao people are based in the Orinoco Delta of northeastern Venezuela. Is that correct?
That is correct,
and
yeah. Actually, the word Orinoco is it comes from the Warao language.
Do they also span Guyana, Suriname?
I think that there are some in Guyana and Suriname, and there's also some, maybe less than 10,000 in other areas of Venezuela, but close to the Delta, the Orinoco Delta. But the large majority of them are still in the Delta, where something like 40,000, according to the latest census, and they and their ancestors have been there for as long as 9,000 years. They have some oral legends that indicate that their ancestors may have come over walking from Trinidad and Tobago when the sea levels were lower.
Now, the first question here is, how did this migration of the Warao, how did they set their sights on Manaus to begin with? Our audience is probably aware of the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and many have sought refuge in Colombia or Brazil, but Manaus is quite a ways from northeastern Venezuela. How did they end up there?
Yeah, well, to understand that, first you have to understand the issue of why they're leaving the Delta to begin with. These are people who hunt, gather, and fish, and so it seems kind of counterintuitive to think that an indigenous group that can live off of land would be affected by the implosion of the Venezuelan economy. And the reason is because in the past, say, 50 years, really, the Warao people have come to get used to being able to travel outside of the Delta, just to nearby cities or periphery cities, to get consumer goods that they might have wanted, to get medical care, clothing, things that the creature comforts of day-to-day life, the necessities. And a lot of that is because it's very hostile living in the Delta. Very exposed. You're living, on the riverbank, on stilted huts. If you get sick there, it's a serious business. And so they became used to traveling to these, periphery cities. And then when Venezuela started imploding, they went a little bit further into Brazil, into Brazilian border towns. Pacaraima and Boa Vista specifically, but they're very small, less than 500,000 people, and the opportunities are scarce there. And so, as they became saturated, not just with Warao people, but also other Venezuelans, they had to go even farther, and they made their way down to Manaus, 1,000 miles south of their homeland.
Now, one of the interesting things that you noted in your article is that from the perspective of an indigenous tribe, very isolated like the Warao, they see begging in an urban environment almost as kind of an extension of their hunting and gathering mentality. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there are very few people, first of all, who studied the Warao, and one of the leading anthropologist is Alvaro Garcia Castro, Venezuelan, and now lives in Spain. And this is his affirmation, which I haven't seen contested anywhere else, because this is what they've done for the past several decades. It's not like it began in Manaus. When the original thing that prompted them to leave the Delta and start seeking out cities nearby was the damming of a tributary, and that caused the salination of the water and soils, and so they started leaving for certain foods and things, but they'd always come back.
Now, was that for hydroelectric power, or?
Excuse me?
Was the damming of the river for hydroelectric power or for something else?
I think it was for irrigation, if I don't remember.
Okay.
The Manaus Dam or something in the late 1960s. I can't remember the purpose of it. But the point is, when they came to these, they started coming to these, periphery cities, they would beg, and this wasn't something that, based on the interviews that Garcia Castro did with them, this wasn't something them hanging their heads in shame as they, extend their hands for alms. They see this as part of gathering, part of life. And the people I spoke to, who also spend their days, begging in traffic in Manaus, didn't say it with shame. I've interviewed homeless people. I've interviewed people who are hard, down on their luck and doing things that they normally wouldn't have to do. And there's always a certain level of resignation, and I didn't feel that at all with them. They really just seemed like, this is what they're doing.
Sure. Now,
this is how they are getting by.
First question that comes to mind about the migration: how do they get there? What are the logistics? How do they get hard currency? I'm assuming it's a combination of boat transport via rivers and bus travel.
It's actually all bus.
All bus, okay.
Well, first to get out of the Delta, they obviously take their boats to the closest periphery city, which is Tucupita. Has somewhere in the neighborhood, a little less than 100,000 people, and that's right by them. I mean, let's say less than 10-hour boat ride from where most of them live in the Delta, and from there they get the bus on the road as far south as the road effectively goes, which is to Manaus. But you have to do a bus to, I can't remember the Venezuelan town that's near the border there. But then you go across to Pacaraima and then to Boa Vista and then one or two more on the way south to Manaus. And I think it's a combination of 4 buses.
Now, with their Venezuelan cédulas or what have you, their Venezuelan identifications, do they have the automatic right to enter Brazilian territory?
It gets a little tricky with the Warao specifically because a lot of them don't have proper ID.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And that's a problem, and especially because in order to ask for asylum, you're supposed to go to the federal police in the border state of Roraima, which a lot of them don't do. And so, yes, they in theory can come across like other Venezuelans, but it does get a little tricky with ID, and that's the source of more bureaucratic headaches when they're trying to have their refugee status approved or say get work, or when they had the unofficial referendum on the Constituent Assembly in Venezuela. They did a vote in Manaus as well, and none of them voted, and at least part of that is because a lot of them don't have IDs.
Sure. How long are we talking between the boat trip out of the Delta and the bus to get from the Orinoco Delta to Manaus?
I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a week. It depends. I mean, some of them stop along the way for a couple days in
Sure.
Pacaraima or Boa Vista.
And we're talking very bad roads, I'm imagining.
Did that as well.
These are very rudimentary roads. We're not talking highways and so forth.
It is a highway going between Manaus and Boa Vista at least. I don't know between Boa Vista and the border, but based on my experience in rural Brazilian roads, you can bet that it's not the best highway you've ever been on.
Yeah.
The roads, once you get out into the far away from Sao Paulo, Rio, the roads out in the hinterland get a bit dodgy.
Slow going.
Quality.
How are the Warao viewed by the Brazilian population in Manaus, and what is the government's approach? I mean, obviously we're talking about a country that is not doing well economically, especially after the past generation where Brazil was in the middle of an economic boom.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when they first got there, really, the people opened their hearts to the Warao. And at least part of this has to do with Manaus's history as a destination for economic and climate refugees. A lot of people came there from the Northeast during its
the droughts,
successive droughts, and they would, Manaus used to be a tiny little town, and then it was a rubber boom town, and people flooded in. So this isn't the sort of place where, everyone there has been living there for hundreds of years, and then suddenly you have refugees showing up on their doorstep. This is a place that has, for the past more than 100 years, been taking people in. And most recently, the Haitians, since the 2010 earthquake. And so at first, the Warao were very warmly received, and people donated food and donated clothes and really did their best to welcome them. I think after a time, it became clear that the Warao were not, trying to integrate into society. They're not trying to get jobs. They're begging in the streets a lot of times, most of the time, and they are trying to get, clothes, food, money, and bring it back to the Delta. Just as an idea, of numbers, there's about 500 Warao in Manaus right now, and between May and mid-July, 125 went back to the Delta, and while they go back, others come as well to replace them. It's like this sort of rudimentary system of remissions, if you will, and so I think then people in Manaus started to get a little bit more, let's say,
less charitable,
uncomfortable with their presence.
Sure.
Them as sort of a permanent fixture of begging, which they didn't necessarily like.
Now, two questions here in conjunction with the points you just raised. At this juncture, what are the prospects that they will be granted permanent residency and or work permits? And also, what is the language proficiency of the Warao? I mean, their first language is Warao. Their second would be Spanish. And do any of them have a command in Portuguese?
So we'll go one question at a time. As far as the work permits, it's complicated for the ID reasons that I mentioned, and also the fact that it's not just these Warao who are asking for status there. It's also the thousands of Venezuelans who've non-Venezuelans who've come across the border. So the federal police is really facing a backlog, a significant backlog, in trying to, go through this list of applicants. And then also, your second question. Remind me your second question.
Oh, the language proficiency.
Yeah, so I would say that of the Warao who I spoke with, and I spoke to, easily dozens, I would say at best, half of them speak some Spanish, and probably a quarter can speak Spanish decently, and very few speak Spanish like, a non-indigenous Venezuelan. And so this really complicates things. When I went to some of their medical consults, people who don't speak any, they don't speak Portuguese, first of all, but people who don't speak any Spanish have to have their interactions with the doctor translated twice. Once when they speak from through a translator from Warao to Spanish, and then that goes to the city employee who translates Spanish to Portuguese for the doctor who doesn't speak anything but Portuguese. So
it's a logistical nightmare.
How difficult it is to apply for a job when that's the case. This is a very vulnerable and marginalized group of refugees.
Now, as we know, in the wake of the impeachment of Dilma and Vice President Michel Temer taking office, it would be fair to say he's something of a lame duck. Is Temer the one who's really calling the shots on this refugee humanitarian situation, or is it really more the municipal and the state government of Amazonas?
Well, first, I wouldn't say he's a lame duck. He does have very low approval ratings, nearly as low as possible. but he did avoid
impeachment,
the Supreme Court trial over corruption charges or corruption allegations, and he is pursuing some reforms now that look like they may actually go through. But it's not really the federal government. I would say that it's much more the regional governments, the state governments, Amazonas and Roraima, that are doing this, and the city of Manaus and the city of Boa Vista, which is the capital of Roraima. The reason that there are a lot of Warao, roughly about the same amount, I should say, in Boa Vista. The reason they're not spotlighted in this article is because this is for our cities edition, and Boa Vista doesn't really register as sort of a metropolis. Doesn't have the same sort of history and the rubber boom. But it's really the regional or the local governments that are doing this. Although the federal government is discussing possibly creating a refugee center at the border for 200 Warao, which is a drop in the bucket. We've got 500 in Roraima or 500 in Boa Vista and Manaus each, and then potentially, I don't think 40,000 are going to come from the Delta, but it could be a lot more.
Are the children, say 5 to 18 roughly, are they allowed to attend Brazilian schools?
They will be. They will actually even be able to receive benefits from Brazil's Bolsa Familia cash transfer program. This is something that the city government is working to get their paperwork and in order to make that happen. But the question here, the fundamental question with these people is that most of them aren't planning to stay. These are not the Syrian refugees who are coming to, say, Rio de Janeiro and are starting a new life necessarily. Most of them are doing this sort of back and forth. However, as they have for decades, the difference with Manaus is that it's so far away. It's the type of travel that these people have never done before. It's so far from home and such a big city that some of them are in fact staying and hoping to get jobs and aren't making plans to go back. And two of those people are featured in this story. The relatives of them also aren't planning to go back. It's not like they're the only two, but the majority of people aren't going to be sending their kids to school there. They're going to be shuttling back and forth between the Delta, or at least that's what they say now.
What is the breakdown roughly? I mean, is there, for example, who are the ones typically that are planning to do this repeated migration? Who are the ones who want to go back permanently, and who are the ones who are interested in staying permanently in Manaus?
It's tough to say, really. I guess the only trend I could say to sort of break that out would be the Warao who I met, who tend to speak better Spanish, are more inclined to stay, but that's probably not so surprising.
Sure. Now, in addition to the city of Manaus and the state of Amazonas, what are there NGOs that are working in the city, or something like Caritas, the Catholic charity, or
it's really Caritas. Caritas is leading the efforts on the NGO side.
Now, what, if any, has been the position of the Maduro regime on this exodus? Have they said anything?
I haven't seen anything. I think they've got, bigger headaches, bigger problems, and admitting something like this is going on doesn't look good. The Chavez regime, this is an example, during the Chavez days, between 2001 and 2009, Chavez, brought out the Warao on his TV show, Allo Presidente, to sort of show, the benevolence of the regime. I was watching one from, I think it was 2007. You have these people beamed live to him from the riverside, gushing about how wonderful this new river transport system is going to be for them, so they can get to the city I mentioned before, Tucupita, and the translator to Spanish seizes the opportunity to gush about how the Warao are full-fledged members of the socialist revolution, and he wishes them a happy birthday, and it's this whole spectacle. And then I spoke to someone who says they don't believe that river transport system ever came to be. So a lot of this stuff, and I spoke to people as well. It seems like the Chavez regime was over-promising in many cases what they would actually be giving to the Warao. But they were at least trying to help or doing, spending money on them. And then the Maduro government has done, according to them, done nothing. That's their take on it, which is a very, let's say, localized view of it. The reality is much more like that Chavez had money to spend and Maduro did not. It wasn't a question of, let's say, he didn't prioritize indigenous people or something like that, but that's how a lot of the Warao phrase it.
Thank you. Oil price falling from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel.
Yeah, that's basically the reason.
We've been speaking today with David Biller, a staff writer at Bloomberg News and a contributor to Business Week. David, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.